Watertown, New York, 1999. Winter had come early that year, and the snow blanketed the town like a crisp, white secret. The air smelled of frost and burning wood, and the streets were eerily quiet, muffled by the snowfall. The houses, modest and tightly packed, seemed to huddle together for warmth under the slate-gray sky. Inside one such home, Claire Bennett stood by the window, her fingers brushing the frost-kissed glass as she watched the snowflakes fall like fleeting memories. Claire had always thought her life was picture-perfect. Married to Thomas Bennett, a diligent and predictable man, she lived in a world of routine. Morning coffee brewed at exactly 6:30 a.m., laundry folded with military precision, and weekly dinners with their only neighbors, the Campbells. But that perfection felt like a thin veneer, barely masking the emptiness underneath. Each meticulously planned day felt like a cage, its bars forged from predictability and monotony. She often found herself staring out the window, longing for something she couldn't quite define, a spark to reignite the parts of her that had been dimmed by years of complacency and unspoken dissatisfaction. Deep down, Claire craved something more, though the thought itself filled her with guilt. But beneath the facade of her tidy existence, Claire carried a weight she couldn't name, a restlessness that gnawed at her soul in the quiet hours. It was on one such evening, during a dull dinner with the Campbells, that her life took an unexpected turn. The neighbors, Eileen Campbell, a chatty, church-going woman, and her teenage son, Ethan, were seated at the Bennett's oak dining table. Thomas and Eileen exchanged polite small talk about snow shoveling techniques, but Claire's attention had drifted. Her gaze lingered against her better judgment on Ethan. He had grown up overnight, it seemed. At 18, Ethan carried himself with an easy confidence that contrasted with the awkward boy she remembered from years past. Ethan had a quiet intensity about him. His jet-black hair fell messily over his forehead, giving him an effortless, boyish charm. His dark eyes held a spark of mischief, but there was also an unspoken depth, as though he carried secrets far beyond his years. He had a way of holding her gaze a second longer than was polite, his crooked smile daring her to look away. It wasn't just his looks, it was the way he moved, unhurried but deliberate, with the kind of confidence that made Claire feel as though he knew exactly the effect he had on people, and on her. She told herself it was nothing, just an innocent observation. But when Ethan caught her staring and offered a crooked smile, she felt her cheeks flush. It was the kind of smile that lingered, a smile that hinted at shared secrets yet to be spoken. After dinner, as the Campbells prepared to leave, Claire found herself alone with Ethan in the kitchen. He had offered to help her clear the table, while the others bundled up in the foyer. The air between them felt charged, heavy with words unspoken. As Ethan handed her a plate, his fingers brushed against hers. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, like static electricity on a winter's night. "Thanks for dinner, Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice low and smooth. "Your cooking's way better than my mom's." Claire laughed softly, a nervous, breathless sound. "Oh, I'm sure that's not true." "It is," he insisted, leaning slightly closer. "You make everything better." His words hung in the air, daring her to acknowledge the double meaning. Claire's heart raced, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She wanted to tell him to stop, to step back, but instead she stood frozen, the plate trembling slightly in her hands. Then, just as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. Ethan stepped away, flashing her another one of his enigmatic smiles before disappearing into the hall. That night, Claire lay awake beside her husband, staring at the ceiling as snowflakes danced beyond the bedroom window. Ethan's voice echoed in her mind, along with the brief touch of his hand. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, a passing moment of distraction, but her thoughts betrayed her. Her mind drifted back to the early days of her marriage, when Thomas's touch had once made her feel alive, desired. She remembered their laughter, their whispered promises under starlit skies. But now, those memories felt distant, like faded photographs tucked away in a forgotten box. Ethan, in contrast, brought an immediacy she couldn't ignore. The way he looked at her, as though she were more than just a wife or a neighbor, ignited a longing she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just attraction, it was the thrill of being seen, of being noticed in a way that stripped away the monotony of her carefully curated life. Guilt clawed at her, sharp and unrelenting, yet it couldn't extinguish the tiny ember of something dangerous that had been lit deep within her. And once lit, it began to burn, flickering against the shadows of all she had tried to suppress. In the days that followed, Ethan seemed to appear everywhere. He shoveled their driveway without being asked, claiming he was in the neighborhood anyway. One afternoon, as Claire knelt in the garden, trying to clear snow from her buried rose bushes, Ethan appeared beside her with a grin. "Need a hand?" he asked, leaning casually on a shovel he had brought over. Claire hesitated, but nodded, her voice catching as she said, "I'd appreciate it." Together they worked in silence at first, the crisp air filled with the rhythmic scrape of shovels and the occasional puff of their breaths. But soon, Ethan broke the silence. "You take care of this garden like it's a treasure," he said, nodding at the bushes, "even in the snow." Claire laughed softly. "It gives me purpose, I suppose, something to nurture." "Doesn't Thomas help you out here?" he asked innocently, but his tone carried a note of curiosity. "Thomas has other priorities," she replied, her voice faltering. For a moment, their eyes met, and Claire saw a flicker of understanding in Ethan's expression, as if he could read between the lines. He handed her a rose stem he had carefully uncovered, his fingers grazing hers. "You've got a knack for this," he said, his voice low. Each encounter was innocuous on the surface, but beneath it, a subtle dance was unfolding, one that neither of them dared to name but both felt in their bones. Claire found herself looking forward to these moments with a mixture of dread and exhilaration. She knew it was wrong, knew that even entertaining the thought was a betrayal of her marriage, but she couldn't help herself. Ethan made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. He looked at her not as a housewife or a middle-aged woman, but as someone vibrant, someone alive. One afternoon, as she walked to the mailbox, she found Ethan waiting at the edge of her driveway, leaning casually against his car. He was dressed in a leather jacket, his breath visible in the cold air. Claire's pulse quickened at the sight of him, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Hey, Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice carrying a teasing lilt. "Need help with the mail?" "I think I can manage," she replied, trying to keep her tone light. "You've got a lot of snow to clear," he said, gesturing to her driveway. "Want me to help?" "That's sweet of you, Ethan, but Thomas will take care of it when he gets home." Ethan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "Well, if you ever need me, you know where to find me." As he drove away, Claire realized she was clutching the mailbox so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She stood there for a long time, staring after him, the snow falling softly around her. She was standing at the edge of something vast and dark and dangerous. The cold air outside seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping her in a chill that felt as much a warning as the storm itself. And though every rational part of her screamed to turn back, another part, a quieter but more insistent part, urged her to take just one more step, like a moth drawn to the glow of a flame it couldn't understand, but couldn't resist. The affair hadn't started yet, not truly, but the first seeds had been sown, and beneath the frozen ground of Watertown, they were beginning to take root. The town of Watertown had always been quiet, its rhythm dictated by the seasons and the snowfall that blanketed its streets. But in the days following Thomas's discovery, an eerie tension seemed to linger in the air. The once predictable hum of daily life now felt like the calm before a storm. Thomas sat in his car, parked outside the Campbell house, the envelope of damning evidence resting on the passenger seat. His breath fogged up the windshield as he stared at the house, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Confrontation was inevitable, but the question lingered: how far was he willing to go to expose the truth? Inside the house, Eileen paced the floor, her hands trembling as she dialed the number she had been avoiding. "Paul, it's Eileen again," she said, her voice strained. "I think this is bigger than I imagined." I need you to look into someone. Alan Hughes. Meanwhile, Claire stood in the kitchen of her own home, staring at the phone in her hand. The missed calls from Thomas and the cryptic messages she had seen earlier were like a noose tightening around her neck. The weight of her choices pressed down harder than ever. When the front door opened and Thomas walked in, she froze. His expression was unreadable, his movements deliberate as he set the envelope down on the counter between them. "We need to talk," Thomas said, his voice calm but edged with something darker. He slid the envelope toward her, watching as her hands shook while she opened it. The photographs spilled out, each one a testament to her betrayal. Claire's face crumpled as she looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, I don't," he interrupted, his voice cracking. "Not yet. I need to know why, Claire. Was it me? Was I not enough?" Across town, Ethan was sitting alone in his car, parked at the edge of the frozen river. The note he had received earlier in the day rested in his lap. It was simple but chilling. "You've gone too far. Walk away, or this ends badly, for everyone." His heart pounded as he considered his next move. The thrill of his connection with Claire was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear that he couldn't outrun. The climax came late that evening when all paths converged at the Campbell house. Thomas, unable to stay silent, had arrived unannounced. Eileen, already on edge, opened the door to find him standing there, his anger barely restrained. "I need to see Ethan," Thomas said, his voice low but firm. "Thomas, please," Eileen began, but he pushed past her into the living room, where Ethan stood frozen, his face pale. The confrontation was explosive. Words were hurled, accusations flew, and secrets were laid bare. Thomas demanded answers. Ethan tried to deflect, and Claire, who had followed Thomas, stood trembling in the doorway. But it was Eileen who finally brought the room to silence. "Enough," she shouted, her voice breaking. "This has to stop before someone gets hurt." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what had been revealed. In the silence that followed, a single knock echoed through the house. Everyone turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, a man in a dark coat, his face shadowed by the porch light. Alan Hughes, the man introduced himself, stepping inside uninvited. "I think it's time we talk. There's more at play here than any of you realize." The room descended into chaos as Hughes began to explain the truth. The surveillance, the orchestrated manipulations, and the deeper connections that tied them all together. Claire's affair with Ethan was only the tip of the iceberg, a distraction from a larger, more insidious game being played. By the time the night was over, the fragile lives of everyone involved had been irrevocably shattered. Trust had been broken, secrets had been exposed, and the once quiet town of Watertown would never be the same. And as the first light of dawn broke over the snow-covered streets, it was clear that the fallout had only just begun. The days rolled into weeks, and with each passing moment, the snow in Watertown grew heavier, as if trying to bury the secrets Claire was beginning to carry. The fire Ethan had kindled within her now smoldered, a dangerous warmth she couldn't extinguish. She found herself watching the clock, counting the hours until she might see him again. But with each passing encounter, the guilt within her grew sharper, pressing down like the weight of the snow outside. One evening, as she set the table for dinner, Thomas approached her from behind and rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "Claire, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. She froze, her mind racing to mask the storm of emotions beneath her calm exterior. "Of course, why wouldn't it be?" she replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thomas lingered for a moment, his gaze searching hers. He sensed that something elusive was slipping through his grasp, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, a hesitation in her movements. Later that night, as Claire showered, Thomas's restlessness got the better of him. He stepped into the dimly lit study and opened the drawer where he'd kept the note he'd found earlier. He reread the scrawled words, "Meet me tomorrow by the back fence." Questions flooded his mind. He knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. Claire hadn't mentioned meeting anyone. Unable to sleep, he decided to test his instincts. At dawn, Thomas left the house under the pretense of clearing the driveway. Instead, he positioned himself where he could see the back fence from a discreet angle. The frosty air bit at his face as he waited, nerves tightening with every minute that passed. Just as the early morning light painted the snow in pale hues, he saw a figure approaching the fence. It was Ethan. The sight was enough to send a jolt through Thomas. The young man leaned casually against the fence, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, scanning the distance. Moments later, Claire emerged, walking with careful, deliberate steps. Thomas's breath caught in his chest as they exchanged words he couldn't hear. The way Ethan leaned closer and Claire glanced around nervously spoke volumes. When Ethan touched her arm, Thomas's fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't a neighborly conversation. It was something far more intimate. Thomas backed away, his heart pounding. He needed to confront her, but not yet. First, he had to understand the extent of what he was dealing with. But before he could retreat completely, the sound of tires crunching against ice snapped his attention toward the front of the house. A sleek, unfamiliar black car was pulling up into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the early morning haze. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in a tailored coat stepped out, his sharp features illuminated by the pale light. Thomas squinted, recognizing him immediately. It was Alan Hughes, a private investigator he had met once through an acquaintance at a company function. The realization sent a chill down Thomas's spine. What was Hughes doing here, and why now? The investigator glanced at the house briefly before pulling a small envelope from his pocket and slipping it under the front door. Without knocking, he returned to his car and drove off. Thomas stepped forward cautiously, his instincts screaming that whatever was in that envelope would only add fuel to the fire. He waited until Hughes's car disappeared down the street before approaching the front steps and picking up the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, grainy but unmistakable, Claire and Ethan by the back fence, their heads close together. The timestamp in the corner confirmed it had been taken only a few days earlier. Beneath the photo was a typed note, "Be careful who you trust, more to follow." Thomas's hands shook as he stared at the photo. His mind raced with questions. Who had hired Hughes? How much did the investigator know? And why was this evidence being delivered anonymously? Before he could process his next move, his phone buzzed. The screen flashed with a notification, a voicemail from an unknown number. Heart pounding, he pressed play.
"Oh, Mr.
Bennett," the voice began, deep and measured. "I know what you're thinking, and you're not wrong. Your wife and Ethan Campbell have crossed lines that can't be undone. But I suggest you tread carefully. There are bigger players involved than you realize, and more at stake than just your marriage. Check your email." The message ended abruptly, leaving Thomas shaken. He quickly logged into his email, where a new message waited in his inbox. Attached was a surveillance video, grainy but clear enough to confirm the worst. It captured Claire and Ethan meeting not only by the back fence, but also outside a remote cabin on the outskirts of town. The timestamp in the corner was damning enough, but as Thomas watched the video, something else caught his attention. A third figure in the background, half hidden by the trees. The person was tall, wearing a dark coat and hat, their face obscured. They stood motionless, watching the scene unfold. Thomas rewound the video twice, his unease growing each time. Whoever this was, they weren't there by accident. But what chilled him most was the timestamp. The video was from that same morning, just hours before Hughes had arrived with the envelope. The realization hit him hard. Someone had been watching Claire and Ethan for weeks, maybe months, and whoever it was, they were orchestrating something far more sinister than exposing an affair. The cryptic warning from the voicemail echoed in his mind. There are bigger players involved than you realize. Thomas couldn't shake the image of the figure in the video. Was it the same person who had sent the envelope and the voicemail, or was this someone else entirely? The realization gnawed at him. If he was being watched, then Claire and Ethan were too. But why? And to what end? Thomas re-entered the house, his movements mechanical as his mind churned. If this was more than just a betrayal, what did it mean? And who else was involved? He didn't notice Claire watching him from the kitchen, her brow furrowed as she picked up on his distracted air. Her voice cut through his thoughts. "Thomas," she asked cautiously, "everything okay?" He turned to her, forcing a tight smile. "Yeah, just tired. Long day." But his mind was anything but at rest. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about finding out who was pulling the strings and what they wanted. The next day, while Claire was out running errands, Thomas busied himself tidying the house. It was a rare habit for him, but his mind sought distraction. As he moved through their shared spaces, his hand brushed against something small on the edge of Claire's vanity. A folded slip of paper, tucked half beneath a bottle of perfume, caught his attention. He hesitated, his instincts warring with his sense of trust. Finally, he unfolded the paper. Written in hurried, almost messy handwriting were the words, "Meet me tomorrow by the back fence." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting was unfamiliar, and the implication hit him like a punch to the gut. Thomas's chest tightened as he folded the paper again, placing it carefully back where he found it. He stood there for a moment, staring at the vanity, at the woman who had once shared her every secret with him, now shrouded in a mystery he couldn't ignore. When Claire returned home later that evening, Thomas tried to mask his unease, but as he watched her move about the kitchen, a strange hollowness grew inside him. She looked the same, sounded the same, yet suddenly she felt like a stranger. And that note, with its cryptic message, gnawed at his resolve. Who had written it? What did it mean? And most importantly, why hadn't Claire mentioned it? That night, as they sat together in the living room, Thomas's gaze lingered on her longer than usual. When she turned and caught him staring, she smiled faintly, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something guarded, something hidden. Thomas's unease deepened, and he resolved to find out the truth, no matter where it led. One crisp morning, Claire ventured into town to pick up groceries. The air was sharp, biting at her cheeks as she parked her car outside the small market. Inside, the store was quiet, save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint chatter of a radio behind the counter. As Claire reached for a carton of milk, she felt a presence beside her. "Morning, Mrs. Bennet," came the familiar voice, smooth and teasing. Startled, she turned to find Ethan standing there, a playful smile tugging at his lips. He wore a thick wool coat, his hair damp with melting snow. For a moment, she felt like a schoolgirl caught passing notes in class. "Ethan," she said, her voice faltering. "What are you doing here?" "Picking up a few things," he replied, holding up a basket with a loaf of bread and a can of soup. "What about you?" "Just running errands," she said, her cheeks flushing under his gaze. "It's nice to see you." "You too," he said, his tone softening. His eyes lingered on hers, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to blur. The air between them crackled, charged with a tension neither dared to name. "I should go," Claire said suddenly, clutching her basket. "Thomas is expecting me." Ethan's smile faded, replaced by something quieter, almost wistful. "Of course, don't let me keep you." As Claire turned to leave, she felt his hand brush against hers, just for an instant. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't look back as she walked out into the snow, her heart pounding against her ribs. Unbeknownst to her, Eileen Campbell, Ethan's mother, was standing just a few aisles away, hidden by a towering shelf of canned goods. She had seen the way Ethan looked at Claire, the way her cheeks flushed under his gaze, and it left her with a sick feeling in the pit of her stomach. Eileen clutched her basket tightly, her knuckles white, as she debated whether to confront Ethan later. The storm brewing in her mind mirrored the one outside, and she knew this was more than just a harmless interaction. Memories of Ethan as a little boy, chasing fireflies in their backyard, flooded her thoughts. She had always seen him as kind-hearted but impulsive, a trait he must have inherited from his late father. Her husband had been the same, charming but reckless, and it had cost them dearly. Eileen had spent years cleaning up the messes left in his wake, vowing that she wouldn't let Ethan repeat the cycle. Now, seeing the same dangerous spark in her son's eyes, she felt the weight of her failure. If she didn't act, she feared this wouldn't just end in heartbreak. It would end in ruin for all of them. It was a spark that could ignite a wildfire, and the wildfire threatened to engulf not just Claire and Ethan, but their entire fragile community. Memories of her late husband, a man as rigid in his morals as he was in his demeanor, flooded her thoughts. She could hear his stern voice warning her about the dangers of meddling, but Eileen's instincts screamed otherwise. If she didn't act, this would end in ruin for everyone involved. Eileen decided to visit Claire the next morning. As she crossed the icy driveway toward the Bennett's house, her mind raced with how to broach the subject without igniting suspicion. When Claire opened the door, her smile didn't reach her eyes, and Eileen felt her resolve strengthen. "Hi, Claire," Eileen said, her voice overly warm. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course," Claire replied, stepping aside to let her in. The house smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon, but the atmosphere felt taut, as if holding its breath. Eileen's eyes swept over the tidy living room before she turned to Claire. "I've been meaning to check in," she began carefully. "You've seemed preoccupied lately. Is everything all right?" Claire's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly. "I'm fine, really. Just the usual winter blues, I suppose." Eileen nodded, but her gaze didn't waver. "It's just, I noticed something yesterday, at the market. You and Ethan." She let the sentence hang, watching Claire's reaction closely. Claire stiffened, her hands tightening around the mug she held. "What about Ethan?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "You seemed close," Eileen said, leaning forward slightly. "Claire, I'm not trying to overstep, but I care about you, and I care about my son. Whatever this is, it's dangerous." Claire's face paled, but she forced a laugh. "Eileen, I don't know what you're talking about. Ethan's a sweet boy, and I've always thought of him like family." Eileen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe that's how it started. But I saw the way he looks at you, Claire, and I saw the way you look at him. If Thomas ever found out..." She trailed off, letting the unspoken consequences linger in the air. Claire's hands trembled slightly, but she set the mug down with deliberate care. "Thank you for your concern, Eileen," she said, her voice cool now. "But you're mistaken. There's nothing going on." Eileen stood, sensing the conversation was over but knowing she had planted a seed of doubt. "I hope you're right, Claire," she said softly, "because secrets like these have a way of unraveling everything we hold dear." As she left, Eileen glanced back at the house, her heart heavy with a mix of dread and determination. She couldn't force Claire to listen, but she wasn't going to let this go. Not yet. Later that evening, Eileen waited for Ethan to come home. She sat at the dining table, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. When the door finally creaked open, and Ethan walked in, she fixed him with a gaze sharp enough to pierce through his carefully constructed mask of nonchalance. "Ethan," she began, her voice low but firm, "what were you doing in the market today?" Ethan blinked, feigning innocence. "Getting groceries." "Why? I saw you with her." "Claire Bennett." Eileen's words hung heavy in the air, the accusation clear. "What do you think you're doing?" Ethan shrugged, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. "I was just being polite, helping her out." "Don't lie to me," Eileen snapped, her voice rising. "I know that look, Ethan. You think I don't see what's happening, but I do. You're playing with fire." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence only fueled Eileen's frustration. "You need to stop this," she continued, her tone almost pleading now. "She's a married woman, Ethan. And Thomas, he's not the kind of man you cross." Ethan finally met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I can handle Thomas," he said quietly, but the resolve in his voice sent a chill down Eileen's spine. She realized then that whatever was happening between Ethan and Claire, it was already too late to stop. That night, Claire sat at the kitchen table long after Thomas had gone to bed. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. A cup of tea sat untouched before her, the steam curling into the air like whispers of things unsaid. She thought of Ethan's hand brushing hers, the warmth of his presence, the way his gaze seemed to strip away every carefully constructed layer she'd built around herself. Her mind raced with questions she didn't dare answer. What was she doing? Why couldn't she stop thinking about him? And most dangerous of all, What would happen if she didn't stop? A knock at the back door shattered the silence. Claire froze, her heart leaping into her throat. For a moment, she thought she'd imagined it. But then it came again, soft but insistent. She rose from the table, her legs unsteady beneath her. As she approached the door, her breath caught in her chest. Through the frosted glass, she could just make out the outline of a figure. Her hand trembled as she unlocked the door and opened it. Ethan stood there, his face partially obscured by the shadow of the porch light. He looked at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice low and raw. "I had to see you." Claire's heart pounded as she stepped back, letting him in. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing them in a bubble of silence. Ethan took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. From the corner of the room, Claire's phone buzzed loudly against the kitchen counter, breaking the stillness. They both froze, the sound pulling them momentarily out of the charged atmosphere. Claire's heart leapt as she glanced toward the screen, seeing Thomas's name flashing. She swallowed hard, her guilt surging to the forefront. "This is wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't be here. Tell me to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you don't want this, tell me to go, and I will." Claire opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The tension between them was palpable, her thoughts a chaotic storm. She glanced back at the phone, its light fading as the missed call notification appeared. Torn between the life she knew and the temptation standing before her, Claire felt the weight of her decisions settling on her like the oppressive winter snow outside. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, she closed the distance between them, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that felt both inevitable and forbidden. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the world in silence as Claire and Ethan crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Unbeknownst to them, Thomas sat in his car parked down the street, his face pale as he clutched the envelope of photos. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a text message from the same unknown that had sent the voicemail earlier. Thomas hesitated, his heart pounding as he stared at the screen. A dozen emotions flitted through his mind: dread, skepticism, and a sharp curiosity he couldn't ignore. His fingers hovered over the phone as questions swirled. Who had sent this? What was waiting for him at the storage unit? And why did it feel like every step he took only led him further into darkness? Finally, unable to resist the pull of answers, he unlocked the phone. The message read, "Check the storage unit. Unit 57. Keyhole Rentals. You'll find what you need." His pulse quickened. Keyhole Rentals was on the outskirts of town, a place he had passed by countless times, but never had reason to visit. Who was feeding him this information, and why? He glanced back at the house, the warm light of the kitchen spilling onto the snow-covered lawn. The shadowed forms of Claire and Ethan inside were a reminder of how little he truly understood about what was happening. Thomas started the engine, the low rumble cutting through the night's silence. He needed answers, and if the text was leading him to them, he wasn't going to wait. Meanwhile, back in the house, Claire stood frozen by the door, her heart racing from Ethan's departure and the near miss of being caught. She grabbed her phone and saw the missed call from Thomas. Her stomach churned as she dialed him back, but the call went straight to voicemail. An unease settled over her, the sinking feeling that her secrets were beginning to unravel faster than she could control. Across town, at Keyhole Rentals, Thomas parked his car outside Unit 57, his breath visible in the frigid air. The lock was already undone, and a single padlock dangled loosely from the latch, as if waiting for him. He slid the door open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Inside, stacked neatly in a corner, were several boxes labeled Campbell. He opened the nearest box, his hands trembling. Inside were photographs, journals, and documents, all detailing Ethan's life. One envelope caught his attention immediately. It was marked with the word leverage in bold, red ink. Inside, Thomas found more photos of Ethan and Claire, along with bank statements, showing large cash transfers to an account under Ethan's name. The dates matched the times when Claire had claimed to be running errands. Thomas's grip tightened on the envelope, his knuckles whitening as a wave of emotions surged through him. Betrayal burned in his chest, sharp and searing, but underneath it was a deeper, quieter pain, an ache born from the realization that the woman he had built his life around had become a stranger. Anger boiled just beneath the surface, his thoughts racing with accusations and doubts, but it was the helplessness that lingered. What could he do with this knowledge? How could he confront a truth that threatened to shatter the foundation of everything he thought he knew? And who was the faceless puppet master pulling the strings of this twisted betrayal? Thomas clenched his jaw, the raw mixture of rage and despair, leaving him breathless as he resolved to uncover the full extent of this conspiracy, no matter what it took. He wasn't sure who he could trust anymore, but one thing was certain: the truth was far darker than he'd imagined. Meanwhile, across town, Eileen Campbell paced the floor of her living room, her anxiety mounting. She had tried to warn Claire and confront Ethan, but the pieces weren't adding up. The private investigator's car she had spotted earlier that week, near the Bennett's house, gnawed at her thoughts. Who had hired him, and why? The gnawing suspicion that Ethan was in deeper trouble than she realized was now impossible to ignore. She picked up the phone, hesitating before dialing the number of an old friend on the Watertown police force. "Paul, it's Eileen," she began. "I need your help with something unusual." Back in the Bennett's kitchen, Claire and Ethan pulled apart, their breaths shallow, as reality began to seep back in. "This has to stop," Claire whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Ethan cupped her face gently, his expression a mixture of defiance and yearning. "Then stop me," he replied, his voice steady but low. "Because I can't stop myself." The sound of a car engine outside made them both freeze. Claire's stomach dropped as she peered through the window, her heart hammering when she saw headlights momentarily pause before disappearing further down the street. She stepped away from Ethan, panic creeping into her voice. "You need to go. Now." Ethan hesitated but nodded, his jaw clenched as he grabbed his coat. "This isn't over," he said softly, before slipping out the back door and into the swirling snow. Claire locked the door behind him, her hand lingering on the cold doorknob, its icy surface sending a shiver through her. She turned and leaned against it, feeling the weight of her actions pressing down like a heavy stone on her chest. The air in the room felt stifling despite the winter chill creeping through the cracks, and she could almost hear the sound of the unraveling threads of her life, fragile and fraying. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, but she couldn't shake the pull Ethan had over her. Somewhere deep down, she feared it was already too late to undo what had been set into motion. Yet as she stood there, the guilt clawing at her chest became suffocating. She thought of Thomas, his dependable smile, the way he carried the weight of their shared life without complaint. Claire's stomach churned as she imagined the look on his face if he ever found out the truth. She moved to the kitchen table and sat down heavily, her head in her hands. Every choice, every moment with Ethan felt like a thread unraveling the tapestry of her marriage, and she didn't know how to stop it. The next morning, as Claire prepared breakfast, her unease grew. Thomas had left for work early, barely speaking to her before he walked out the door. The atmosphere in the house felt heavier than the snowfall outside, a silence laden with unspoken accusations. She sat at the kitchen table, staring into her untouched cup of coffee, the minutes dragging by. The image of Ethan's face lingered in her mind, but so did the ghost of Thomas's distant gaze that morning. She felt trapped, caught between the weight of her guilt and the growing suspicion that her life, carefully constructed and orderly, was unraveling faster than she could hold it together. Across town, Thomas wasn't at work. Instead, he parked his car a block away from the Campbell house, his breath fogging up the cold windshield. As he watched and waited, his thoughts churning with everything he had uncovered. The envelope on the passenger seat seemed to burn a hole in his consciousness, and every passing moment brought him closer to the decision he didn't want to make: confrontation. The early morning sunlight cut through the snow-covered streets, But for Thomas, the world seemed dark and suffocating. He stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the frigid air, and marched toward the house, each step heavy with determination and rage. Inside, Ethan sat at the dining table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Eileen stood by the window, her worry etched into her face. She turned abruptly when the sound of pounding on the door shattered the quiet. Eileen opened the door to find Thomas standing there, his face pale and tense, his eyes burning with anger. Without waiting for an invitation, he pushed past her into the living room. "Where's Ethan?" Thomas demanded, his voice low but seething with fury. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression calm but guarded. "Thomas," he said cautiously, "what's going on?" "You know damn well what's going on," Thomas growled, throwing the envelope onto the coffee table. The photographs spilled out, their stark evidence impossible to ignore. Eileen gasped as her eyes fell on the images, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan's composure faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained it. "Thomas, I can explain." "Explain," Thomas interrupted, his voice rising. "You think there's an explanation for this? For what you've done to my family?" Claire arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion. She froze in the doorway, her face paling as she took in the scene. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" he snapped, turning to her. "What are you doing, Claire?" With him, the room erupted into chaos. Accusations flew, voices rose, and the tension mounted until it felt unbearable. Thomas reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a gun. The room fell silent, the weight of the weapon rendering everyone motionless. "Thomas," Claire said, her voice shaking. "Please, don't do this. I trusted you," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." Ethan stepped forward cautiously, his hands raised. "Thomas, listen to me. This isn't what you think." "Don't," Thomas shouted, aiming the gun at him. "Don't you dare tell me what I think." The room seemed to freeze in that moment, the tension so thick it was suffocating. And then, in a split second, everything shattered. Ethan lunged toward Thomas, trying to disarm him. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Ethan staggered back, clutching his side as blood seeped through his fingers. He collapsed onto the floor, his breath shallow and ragged. Eileen screamed, rushing to her son, while Claire stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. Thomas stared at the scene before him, the gun slipping from his grasp as the reality of what he had done sank in. The room was filled with chaos, Eileen shouting for help, Claire sobbing, and Ethan gasping for air. But for Thomas, the world had gone silent, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a crushing wave.